Hi Year 11, this is the first instalment of Measure for Measure, looking at Act 3, Scene 2. It's a long scene, so I'm going to try to move through it fairly quickly. Please have your copy of Measure for Measure open and read along with me, highlighting and making notes as you go. So we start off set in the prison with the Duke disguised as the Friar and with the comic characters of Pompey and Elbow appearing in it. So basically the gist of this beginning part is that Elbow has arrested Pompey and when the Duke finds out that Pompey has been arrested for being aboard here, the Duke agrees that he should be in prison until he is able to mend his ways. So Pompey tries to talk his way out of it, but the Duke has none of it, is pretty outraged by the whole thing. Then the Duke has got a really interesting rhyming couplet here, which is made more complicated by the use of the commas. So let me just translate it for you first. Basically, he's saying, I wish we were all free from faults, but I also wish that people who did have faults would stop pretending to be faultless. So he's saying that we were all, as some would seem to be, from our faults as faults from seeming free. So there's an emphasis in this rhyming couplet on the concept of seeming, so that idea of false appearances. And of course, this is an instance of dramatic irony because the Duke, when he says this, is dressed as a friar, so he's operating under false appearances himself. So then Elbow responds to that by saying that Pompey is probably going to be hanged. Pompey is a bit upset by this, but then Lucio comes in and Pompey asks him to bail him out. But Lucio is just consistently rude. So we've got accumulation here of a whole bunch of different rhetorical questions that indicate a really rude and dismissive attitude towards Pompey. So you can see there's a totally different attitude here between Lucio's reaction when he first finds out that Claudio is being arrested for lechery and when he finds out that Pompey is being arrested for lechery. So there's a really strong disparity here. So when Pompey finds out that, when Lucio finds out that Pompey is arrested for being a killer, Lucio's response is imprison him because he thinks that it's right for a board to be imprisoned. And so then Elbow is led off. Elbow leads Pompey off into the prison, and Lucio is left with the Duke, who is dressed as a friar. So Lucio asks the Duke, dressed as the friar, if he knows any news of the Duke, and so then Lucio takes that as an advantage to lash into the Duke and blame him for the downfalls of Vienna. So he calls it a mad, fantastical trick for the Duke to leave. So he's obviously very disapproving of the Duke for leaving. And he says that Lord Angelo is duking it well. So using duking as the verb there makes it a bit sarcastic, and it gives the implication that Lord Angelo is sort of behaving above his station, like he's putting on the airs of being a Duke. So we get from this speech that Lucio is angry, and there's a really biting tone to this. So then Lucio goes on to say that he thinks that Angelo is being too strict about lechery, that he should be more lenient. And the Duke says that, well, being severe on this will fix it, it'll stop it from being a problem in Vienna. And Lucio's response to that is that it's impossible to get rid of lechery until eating and drinking be put down. So he's basically saying that unless all of mankind has died, the vice of lust is going to continue to exist when it's not possible to get rid of it. And then he starts to cast aspersions onto Angelo's character. So he says that that perhaps Angelo was spawned out of the ocean like a fish rather than being born through the normal human measure. And he says that certainly when Angelo makes water, his urine is congealed ice. So I don't know if you remember, but in Act 1, we had the Duke himself referring to Angelo as having ice running through his veins instead of blood. But at that point, the Duke meant it as a compliment that Angelo was able to separate himself from his emotions. In this case, Lucio is using it definitely very strongly as a negative. So it's a metaphor being used there for Angelo's character. And he goes on to call Angelo emotion generative, which is sort of like a robot. So saying that he's very unfeeling. And then Lucio asks himself whether the Duke would have behaved in such a way. It's not a rhetorical question because he goes on to say no, the Duke would never have done such a thing. And he starts off sounding very approving of this. So he says, before the Duke would have hanged a man for getting 100 bastards, he would have paid for the nursing of 1,000. So it sounds like he's trying to say that the Duke is really generous and would look after poor orphans rather than trying to punish the people who had created the orphans. So it sounds quite appropriate, but it actually, in actual fact, what he's saying turns out to be quite rude, because he says that the Duke had some feeling of the sport, he knew the service, and that instructed him to mercy. So he's basically saying that the Duke is lenient to adulterers because he himself commits adultery. So obviously the friar, who is really the Duke, is a bit taken aback by this and says, no, I don't think he's an adulterer. And Lucio says, no, he definitely is. And the Duke says, no, I don't think he is an adulterer. And so then Lucio elaborates a little bit, and he uses a reference to generosity again, in order to turn what should be a compliment into something that's quite negative. So he says that the Duke puts a ducat, or money, into a beggar's clack dish, which is like the cup that they collect money in. It's called a clack dish because they clatter the money around in it, so it makes a clacking noise. But that's not what he's really doing there. He's not really commenting on the Duke's generosity towards beggars. He's making a fairly vulgar innuendo there. And then he goes on to cast further aspersions onto the Duke's character by calling him drunk. And the Duke again says, no, I don't think that's right. And Lucio says, no, I'm a confidant of him. I'm a close friend. So I definitely know. And so the Duke is obviously starting to see that Lucio is making this up. And then Lucio goes on and says that most of the people in Vienna consider the Duke to be wise. Obviously, the Duke is quite happy to hear this, so he agrees, yes, the Duke is a wise man. And Lucio contradicts him and says, no, he's superficial, he's ignorant, and he's unweighing. So again, I think that this links back to his sense of anger that Claudio is being put to death tomorrow for lechery, when, of course, Claudio never intended to commit lechery. And that might contain the key for the difference between his reaction to finding out that Pompey is being arrested and his reaction to finding out that Claudio has been arrested. So the Duke is stung into self-defense by this accumulation of negative terms, superficial, ignorant, and unweighing. And so he says, let him be but testimonied in his own bringings forth. So he's saying we should judge the Duke by what he has actually done, by his actions. So this is really telling, because this demonstrates that that's how Shakespeare thinks that we should judge people. And it's certainly how we're judging Angelo, not by his words and by the way that he sort of says that he is, but by the way that he really is, by what his actions reveal about him. And so the Duke says that he is really a scholar, a statesman, and a soldier. So we've got that positive cumulation of three terms to combat Lucio's superficial, ignorant, unweighing negative terms. And so they continue to argue about that. And the Duke, when the Duke comes back, I will call upon you, and I will get you to say that to his face. So it's a little bit threatening. It's sort of suggesting that he's going to charge Lucio perhaps with treason for saying these negative things about the Duke, and he's suggesting that Lucio won't restate them to the Duke's face. And the Duke out and out says this: you'll forswear this, so you'll lie when I say, Lucio said that you were an ignorant, that you were a superficial, ignorant, unweighing fellow, that Lucio will say, no, I didn't, I never said that. And of course, the dramatic irony here is that he's talking to the Duke. The Duke is the friar. So then Lucio changes the topic and says, can you tell me if Claudio is going to die tomorrow? Which I think that change in topic from making fun of the Duke and dismissing the Duke in quite an angry way, and then moving on to Lucio. Well, let me try saying that again. So because Lucio moves from his anger at the Duke, and then when he changes topic, his new topic is Claudio's death, I think that means that we can hypothesize or speculate that Lucio's anger at the Duke stems from his sense of unfairness that Claudio is going to die. So there's a little bit more sexual innuendo here where Lucio is talking about why Claudio is going to die. So I think you can see that Lucio's speech is characterised by this sexual innuendo, this really vulgar language throughout this entire scene. So then he refers to Angelo. He says that I wish the Duke would return because Angelo, who he refers to as an ungenited agent, so agent as in deputy, the agent of the Duke, ungenited as in lacking genitals, will unpeople the province. So he's going to kill everybody because he's so focused on a sin that everybody commits. And then he uses this ridiculous hyperbolic imagery in order to show the extent of Angelo's severity. So he says, sparrows must not build in his house eaves because they are lecherous. So he's saying even innocent little birds, because they're not technically married, they can't build in Angelo's house because he'll arrest them for committing lechery. And then Lucio goes on to say if the Duke would return, he would never let this happen. And again, it sounds like it might be a compliment, but he makes it pretty clear that Lucio thinks that the reason why the Duke would not let it happen is because the Duke commits adultery himself. So there's some more sexual innuendo there for you. So then Lucio leaves the stage and we have a fairly significant rhyming quartet from the Duke Vincentio. So you can see these 4 lines here are his response to all of these negative things that Lucio has just said about him. So he says, no might nor greatness in mortality can censure scape. Back-wounding calumny the whitest virtue strikes. What king so strong can tie the gall up in the slanderous tongue? So it's a very philosophical and rueful comment in tone. He's not angry, he's not upset, he's just kind of almost shrugging his shoulders about how unfair mankind is. So what he's really saying is it doesn't matter how strong or great you are as a ruler, you're always going to be brought down by someone. You can't escape censure. And then he says, even if you have the whitest virtue, even if you're the best person, someone will stab you in the back and say negative things about you. And he says, there is no king who is strong enough to stop his people from speaking negatively about him. And then he sees that Aeschylus and Mistress Overdone are coming, so he changes the topic, but who comes here? That's enough for now, so you'll need to watch the second instalment in order to see what happens in the second half of the scene.